On the morning of May 25, 2013, Marshall University was celebrating the graduation of a new cadre of professionals. Mark and Joanna McDermott were supposed to be among the parents witnessing their children receive their diplomas. However, their day took an unexpected turn. This is the of Mark McDermott, a model family man who faced betrayal by someone he considered and raised as his own son for nearly 20 years. Mark McDermott was born in the early 1960s in Australia. Little is known about his upbringing and personal life. What is known is that Mark was the eldest of 5 siblings. His father, Bruce McDermott, as well as 2 younger sisters, Tracy and Nicole, with Nicole being the youngest, are his only known relatives. Close acquaintances have described Mark as not only a successful businessman, but also a kind and responsive individual. Nicole portrayed her older brother as a wonderful person who could never deliberately cause harm to anyone. Very little information is available about Mark's life, including his adult years. At some point, Mark traveled to the southern United States. The circumstances and reasons for this journey remain unknown. It was during this time in the US that he met Joanna Dunn, a single mother with a 4-year-old child. Even less information exists about Joanna's life. Most accounts come from her own narratives. However, the words she shared publicly were almost entirely dedicated to her son, who is also central to this story, Donald Wayne Dunn. Donald Wayne Dunn was born in the early 1990s in West Virginia, where he lived his entire life with his mother's family. His grandparents played a significant role in his upbringing, since they cared for him most of the time. The reason Joanna, a working single mother, entrusted much of Donald's upbringing to her parents was that she found it challenging to raise a child alone. Even when they managed to spend time together, Joanna often turned to video games and television to entertain Donald. On the rare days they were home together, it was challenging for her to give him all her attention. However, everything changed with Mark's entry into their lives. The couple quickly started a relationship and soon got married. Joanna adopted her husband's last name, and all 3 moved to West Virginia, becoming a very close-knit family from the beginning. Mark and Donald developed a close relationship as if they were truly related by blood. Some who knew them, including Mark's sisters and father, confidently stated that Mark treated the boy as his own son, and Donald regarded him as his only father. Their strong bond was evident. When Donald was still a minor, Mark and Joanna's relationship went through a difficult period that ended in a temporary separation. Despite Mark living alone for some time, Donald insisted on residing with him rather than his mother. During those months, the family faced another challenging period when Joanna was diagnosed with cancer. However, by supporting each other, they managed to get through these tough times. Mark always ensured that his stepson had a comfortable life without any deprivation. He made sure Donald never lacked anything he needed. Although Donald was a simple person who never asked for much, he seemed grateful for the peaceful and luxurious life his stepfather provided. In 2008, when Donald graduated from high school, Mark took on the financial responsibility for his higher education at Rio Noa Community College, where he studied for 2 years. Mark continued to pay for his education, even when, in 2010, Donald transferred to Marshall University. Despite living with his girlfriend, with whom he had been in a relationship since he was 15, and her family, he always enjoyed unconditional support from Mark and Joanna. It's noteworthy that their financial assistance wasn't limited to just tuition fees. They also covered expenses for clothing, car insurance, and paid for his living and food expenses. Donald only had to focus on his studies, a responsible and dedicated young man who strictly followed his daily routine and often cancelled or declined plans with loved ones due to study commitments or practical work requirements for upcoming exams. During his 5 years of university education, he maintained this lifestyle, aiming to graduate on time without falling behind in any semester. Saturday, May 25, 2013, was to be a significant day for him as he was scheduled to receive his diploma. However, what was meant to be as special for celebration turned into a deeply distressing moment that would forever alter his life. As the McCott family prepared for Donald's graduation ceremony, an emergency call was made to 911 from their home. "What is your name?" "Joanna McDermott. I shot my husband." "Okay, is he breathing?" "No." "Was it an accident?" "No, we were fighting." "You were fighting?" "Yes. It was supposed to be a happy day. It's his graduation." "Your child's graduation?" "Yes." "Is your child okay? Will the police be coming too?" "Yes." Authorities promptly headed to the McDermott residence. Sergeant Greg Keon of the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office was one of the first law enforcement officers to arrive at the scene. Upon arrival, he found Joanna in a state of severe shock. Moving further into the house, he saw Mark lying lifelessly on the couch in the living room. It appeared he had been reading a book at the time of his death. At first glance, Mark had 2 gunshot wounds to the head. When investigators moved the body, they discovered a 3rd wound in the back of his shoulder. The medical examiner at the scene confirmed that although the cause of death was indeed due to head wounds, death was likely not instantaneous. The amount of blood at the scene indicated that Mark's prolonged survival led to significant blood loss. According to initial reports on the incident, Donald had been preparing for his significant day, and noise from the shower drowned out the sound of gunshots. Consequently, he did not realize Joanna had shot his stepfather until he exited the bathroom and found Mark's body in the living room. "All right, how old is your husband?" "My husband is 54. "And you were just fighting?" "Yes." "All right, did you shoot him in the side?" "No, in the head." "In the head?" "Yes." "Okay, try not to touch anything." "My son is in the bathroom. I need to attempt to go downstairs so he can assist me." "How old is your son?" "He is 23. "Does he know what has happened?" "He doesn't know. He's downstairs for his graduation." The pistol was lying on the dining table next to a letter, presumably written by Joanna and addressed to Donald. In it, the distressed woman explained to her son that her marriage had become intolerable and that she could not stay in a relationship with someone she no longer loved. She also apologized for leaving his life without seeing him grow into a man. At that moment, Joanna and Donald were taken in separate cars to the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office, where an officer was to take their statements. Since Joanna called emergency services, the case appeared to be another instance of domestic violence with a tragic conclusion. In her conversation with the operator, Joanna claimed that she and Mark had argued, and in a fit of rage without realizing her actions, she shot him in the head with her pistol. This narrative surprised the officers who took her for questioning, because she then made a confession that completely overturned her initial story and thus changed the entire course of the investigation. When the doors of the police car closed, Joanna revealed that it was not she who ended Mark's life, but her son Donald. However, this revelation was not all. The story turned out to be far more intricate than what investigators had assumed. Once in the interrogation room, Joanna recounted to Captain James Barr of Raleigh County Sheriff's Office the sequence of events that took place on May 25, 2013. She mentioned that her son's graduation was scheduled for earlier in the day. In the morning, she left home to run some errands and buy groceries. Upon returning home, and as she was about to get out of her car, Donald approached her and asked her to close her eyes, follow him into the house. He had a surprise for her. Trusting her son had prepared something special, she blindly followed him into the dining room, where he suggested she sit down. At that moment, Joanna heard a distinctive click. When she finally turned to look at Donald, she found herself face to face with the barrel of her own pistol in his hands. The gun did not fire. Joanna, completely frightened, managed to grab it and wrest it from her son's hands. She overcame her panic, which allowed her to think clearly and devise a plan of action to save herself from becoming Donald's second victim. Seeing Mark's lifeless body, she quickly told Donald that she was going to call emergency services and take the blame for the crime. Although the young man initially seemed to doubt her plan, he eventually agreed. During the interrogation, Joanna explained that she decided to call emergency services to protect herself from her own son. She understood that by confessing to a crime she did not commit, she would end up behind bars. Joanna added that she was sure that if she didn't do this, Donald would try to end her life. She also confessed that in the 23 years she had been his mother, she never thought he would point a gun at her head and pull the trigger. The gun used by Donald belonged to Joanna. She explained that it did not fire, probably because she had pulled the slide back far enough on the semi-automatic weapon, which prevents a normal shot. Captain Barr explained that Joanna's story seemed entirely logical to him because from the first moment he saw Donald, he had a feeling something was off. He noted that considering the severity of the situation, the 23-year-old young man appeared unusually calm and always maintained a neutral facial expression. For this reason, he ordered Donald be placed in a separate interrogation room away from his mother from the beginning of the interrogation. Donald denied any involvement in his stepfather's death. His facade, however, quickly crumbled when he was told of Joanna's statements. James Barr did not need to use any intimidation tactics to get the young man to confess. He didn't pressure him or demand detailed information to piece together the case. Donald voluntarily provided everything. The story that unfolded was almost unbelievable. It all began after Donald's first year of college. He wasn't doing well in his studies and decided to drop out due to poor grades. Initially, his classes were simple. Just showing up at the right room and time was enough for good grades. But as the semester progressed, it required more effort. According to Donald, he felt he didn't have the strength to continue his studies. Instead of telling the truth, he chose to lie to Mark and Joanna. His close relatives were not the only ones deceived. Even his girlfriend and her family were unaware of what was happening. Rachel Rush, his girlfriend's sister, said Donald maintained a routine that made it seem like he was attending classes. He left and returned home at regular times, spending most of his day in his room under the pretense of needing focus for assignments or tests. Donald even went as far as falsifying grade reports. This deception lasted for 4.5 years without anyone suspecting a thing. His family's faith in him remained unwavering as he pretended to be a student. Joanna and Mark had no idea that their son was misusing the money they provided to support him. Donald claimed he never meant to deceive his family for so long. But as days went by, speaking the truth just got harder and harder. The one thing that stopped him from being honest? The fear that Mark and Joanna would stop covering his expenses. Even though he acted like material things, a car and fancy clothes didn't matter much, the reality different. Losing his lifestyle was a big deal for him. Over several months, Donald thought he had the perfect plan to get away everything. From the start, he planned something drastic, to take his parents' lives. He wanted to avoid suspicion by leaving a note, something similar to what was found on the dining table with the pistol. Donald believed that when authorities read it, they'd think it was written by a distressed woman stuck in an unhappy marriage who saw no other way but to take her husband's life and then her own. On May 25th, Donald told Captain Barr that he secretly took Joanna's pistol and kept it all day while pretending to prepare for his graduation. Part of his plan included creating an alibi by going to the supermarket so surveillance cameras would record him there. However, things didn't go as planned. He didn't expect his mother's gun to jam, just as he tried to pull the trigger aimed at her head. The conclusions and plans Donald revealed later baffled everyone who heard them. James Barr shared that Donald even confessed he had practiced the emotions he'd display on his face when authorities arrived at the scene. He also considered how he would finance his life after losing the stable income provided by Mark, and decided to rely on the sympathy of his relatives for as long as. While they supported him, he planned to engage in sports to improve his physical condition. Ultimately, when left with no other options, he intended to enlist in the police or the army. Reflecting on the feasibility of his plan, Donald concluded it would be easier to kill his mother and stepfather than to confess that he had been deceiving them for almost 5 years. According to a legal document from the Supreme Court of West Virginia, published in April 2016, a month after his arrest in June 2013, Donald was charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. Even before the trial commenced, Donald and his legal team sought ways to delay proceedings. A few weeks before the scheduled start of hearings, while already in solitary confinement, Donald underwent surgery on his right hand. His lawyers used this surgery as a pretext to request a delay in starting the process, and arguing that during initial sessions, Donald would be under strong painkillers' influence. To decide on this matter, the court first required medical documents of the defendant. Eventually, the request was denied. The court observed that during preliminary hearings, Donald showed no signs of being significantly impaired by painkillers, and thus deemed him competent to participate in the trial, approving its continuation. The trial took place in August 2014, more than a year following Mark's tragic death. The jury trial was presided over by Judge John A. Hutchinson, with David White serving as Donald's attorney and Christine Keller representing Raleigh County Prosecutor's Office. Mark's two sisters, accompanied by one niece, traveled over 15,000 kilometers from Australia to witness the trial of someone they had considered family for nearly 20 years. Although detailed information from witness testimonies or evidence presented is not available, and there is a lack of photos and videos, it is known that the defense intended to state in their opening arguments that Donald was under illegal drugs influence at the time of the crime. There is no evidence that this was ever referenced before or confirmed through any toxicological tests. Just a few days after the initial, specifically on August 14, 2014, Donald Dunn was found guilty of the first degree of his stepfather, Mark McDermott. He was also convicted of attempting to murder his mother, Joanna McDermott, and using a firearm in the commission of these crimes. On September 5th of the same year, Judge John Hutchinson sentenced Donald to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for his stepfather's murder, and an additional 15 years for attempting to murder his mother. After the sentence was announced, Joanna read an emotional letter she had prepared for the court. In her statement, Donald's mother mentioned that something bad had happened at some point in her son's life, possibly after his grandparents' illness, or due to the pressure she applied for him to study at the university. She also suggested that frequent play of violent video games from a young age might have had an impact. Joanna expressed her disapproval of the public image created of her son and made clear her disagreement with the harsh sentence handed down. Judge Hutchinson responded that Joanna's disapproval did not influence his decision. He stated that he believed the sentence imposed was necessary to restore justice in this unjust situation. The judge sympathized with Donald's mother, but maintained that shielding her son from the consequences of his actions could not be justified under these serious circumstances. After the verdict, Mark's sister and father expressed their continuing disbelief at how Donald could take the life of a man who had raised him as his own son for 19 years. Though they acknowledged that Mark would never be brought back by this verdict, they were grateful for the judgment rendered by Judge Hutchinson. This story is about a woman whose life is filled with lies from beginning to end. You will learn how the unscrupulous deceiver ends up in pursuit of big money and how many human destinies it can affect. Michelle grew up in the town of Hurst in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. She had a younger sister, Laura. The girl's mother left home in search of a better life, so the upbringing of children was the father. It was not easy for a man to raise two daughters alone. He survived on occasional earnings at a construction site and often relied on alcohol. In search of easy money, he repeatedly thought up and implemented devious plans for profit. He would take a job at one factory or another and deliberately injure himself in order to obtain insurance money compensation. The fraud scheme worked, but not for long. With the help of CCTV cameras at one of the workplaces, the scheme was uncovered, and Michelle and Laura's father was sent into custody. Michelle grew up in a world of lies, deceit, and manipulation from childhood. This was her normal life, from which she wanted to escape by any means possible. But it is impossible to escape from herself, because lies have already become a part of her life, and she simply did not know how to live differently. The girl dreams of growing up faster to get out of the hated poverty. At the age of 15, Michelle looks very spectacular, a petite brunette of athletic build. She attracts a lot of interest from guys both of her own and older age. Even then, Michelle realizes that with the help of her feminine power and charm, she can easily manage to manipulate any men in her environment in order to get what she wants. So in her life begins a series of love relationships with different men. At the age of 17, Michelle drops out of school and marries for the first time to 16-year-old Kenneth O'Brien. She informs the boyfriend that she is expecting a baby. Kenneth, taking full responsibility for his young wife and future child, enlists in the army. The couple moves frequently. 2 more children are born to them in this marriage. One city is replaced by another. Temporary housing of the military was not the limit of Michelle's dreams. Such a life does not suit her, and after 5 years, she leaves, naming the reason for divorce beatings and cheating on the part of her husband. Michelle returns to her native Hearst. In front of relatives and friends, she appears as a victim of domestic violence and receives the necessary support and begins to organize her life anew. After a while, she falls in love with her former classmate Brandon. The young man is head over heels in love with Michelle and gladly accepted her 3 children. The lovers prepare for the wedding. However, on the eve of the wedding, Michelle infuriates Brandon. It turns out that the girl did not divorce her first husband. She was very afraid to talk to him about divorce because of the abuse, so she did not send the documents. With the help of a lawyer, this issue was quickly settled and the couple was able to marry in 1994. At first, family life flowed calmly and measured. Brandon was engaged in the development of his IT company, and Michelle worked as a dental assistant. But quiet family life was not the limit of Michelle's dreams. She has always needed more. She starts bringing home all sorts of dental equipment and supplies. The cash doesn't fit in her purse. Brandon suspected something wrong. Eventually, Michelle was caught stealing. It was only by luck that a trial was avoided. But Brandon's trust issues with his wife were just beginning. Responding to neighbors' reports that cars were frequently arriving at the house while he was at work, Brandon installed a tape recorder in several rooms of the house. Listening to the tape, he heard various men visiting their home throughout the day. Brandon does his own little investigation and learns that the reason for the divorce in Michelle's first marriage was her numerous infidelities, not her husband's beatings, as she told everyone. Brandon's patience broke and he demanded a divorce. Michelle was furious that Brandon initiated the divorce, and while he was at work, she got back at him. "I had a very nice saltwater aquarium with thousands of dollars worth of fish in it," Brandon says. "She poured Comet into it and killed all the fish." But Michelle didn't stop there. Brandon also had a beloved dog named Domino. Michelle stuffed the dog with sleeping pills, which led to the death of the living creature. Michelle put Domino to sleep. "If you're shocked at this point, we've only scratched the surface," Brandon says. "It was a nightmare that wouldn't stop. You can't make that girl go away." Unfortunately, Brandon learned the truth about Michelle when his own marriage was completely destroyed. Everything Michelle did with Brandon Dixon pales in comparison to her adventures with other men. It was later revealed that John Paul Ray, also a student at the high school Michelle attended in Hearst, was the father of her first child. Instead of revealing this information to John, she told Kenneth O'Brien that the child was his, forcing him to marry her. Kenneth, for 13 years, thought the eldest son was his own. John later told police that Kenneth paid child support from age 5 to 18 and did not know he was not the father. After Brandon and Michelle divorced, she moved in with John, the father of her first child. They lived in a common-law marriage for 8 years. Their relationship came to an abrupt end when John began to suspect his wife of cheating. Michelle didn't deny it. She confirmed the affair on the side. John moved out, leaving most of Michelle's possessions. Michelle's next love was Greg Williams. They were both not so young anymore. Both had a history of past marital failures. The man was married twice and had a daughter. After Greg and Katie divorced in 2003, the couple agreed to share custody of their common daughter, Taylor. However, there was no formal agreement on child support, because the former spouses had a good relationship. Rich, successful, and generous Greg was a perfect match for Michelle. In 2007, Greg and Michelle had a common daughter, Michaela. A year later, they got married. Their marriage was like the American dream. Money, children, love, it was all in abundance. Michelle seemed to have made it through the thorns to the stars and got the life she had always dreamed of. Greg Williams held his family in very high esteem. He grew up in a family with fierce principles and achieved everything on his own from an early age. He loved sports and was a martial arts black belt. In addition to his love of exercise, Greg was also a fan of guns. Both he and Michelle had guns that they kept in their home in Keller. Michelle's gun, a silver .40 caliber pistol, was kept in a safe, but Greg kept his gun, a black Liebherr .45 caliber, always loaded in a case under his bedside table. The couple was determined to make their marriage a success. They threw birthday parties for their children from other marriages at their home in Keller. Michelle's adult children would have barbecues and swim parties. Very often the house was full of friends. But despite the picturesque suburban home and a precocious daughter, Greg and Michelle were not the classic American couple. They met through an online community for bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism, and their wild adult house parties led to numerous complaints from neighbors. Without making the matter public, the couple decides to move out. The night before, Michelle and Greg had been unable to sleep for a long time. They were preparing to buy a new house for $4.5 million. They emotionally discussed the upcoming event. Greg stayed in the bedroom alone. Michelle went out to her crying daughter and fell asleep with her in the room. On October 13, 2011, at 4:40 a.m., an emergency call came in. A crying woman screamed into the phone that she and her husband had been attacked by a robber. She was injured, and her husband had been shot. Within minutes, police arrived at the scene of the tragedy. Inside the home, detectives found a television on full volume and a baby sleeping on the couch. Michelle's daughter was sound asleep and unaffected in any way by the attack that occurred. The woman's behavior alerted police officers. She was behaving rather strangely and did not look like she had just experienced a burglary. Soon, the gated community was filled with police cars, detectives, and forensic experts. The lot was cordoned off, and police searched every inch of the nearly 5,000-square-foot home. Michelle was fully dressed, had her hair styled, and was acting very calm. She told police she was asleep, but her clothing and demeanor said otherwise. As the only witness, Michelle was taken to the Keller Township Police Station for questioning. After several hours of talking to police and investigators, Michelle's story began to fall apart like a house of cards. According to the woman, the intruder, dressed in all black, hit her on the head with a wrench. She fell from the blow, but was conscious and heard a gunshot. The stranger then fled through the back door of the house. Michelle Williams's account did not match what police saw at the scene. Greg Williams was shot in the head while lying in bed. A .45 caliber handgun, presumably used by the intruder, was found near the back door next to a wrench. There were no fingerprints on either weapon. Neither was found to show any signs of forced entry. The family's valuables and money were untouched. Examined CCTV footage from a neighbor's camera showed that only one car had entered the gated community in the hours before the crime. Police confirmed that the car belonged to a newspaper delivery man. To confuse the investigation, Michelle came up with a version of the attack. She hit herself with a wrench and made their large house look like the scene of the attack. But detectives did their due diligence and noticed a number of details that didn't add up. Michelle Williams was fully dressed. Her hair was styled, and she had fresh makeup on her face. It gave the impression as if she was waiting for someone. The gun used during the crime was found in the house, without any fingerprints, and the final detail that proved Michelle's lie was the $20,000 in cash that was not stolen in the robbery. Michelle had no explanation for why a successful businessman and devoted father decided to take his own life, but she was able to explain her behavior. Michelle claimed she wanted to spare their young daughter the bitter truth about her father's self-inflicted death. She admitted to police that she wiped down the gun and washed Greg's hands to cover up fingerprints before desperately staging a home invasion and calling emergency services. As bizarre as that explanation was, it became obvious to police why no evidence was found in the house. Michelle admitted to wiping the crime scene with bleach and hitting herself in the face with a wrench to present a more realistic picture of the attack. From the beginning, Keller police doubted the credibility of Michelle's testimony. But at the time, no physical evidence was presented linking her to the crime. Michelle was arrested for perjury, but was soon released home. Around 5 p.m. on the evening of her husband's murder, Michelle went to her sister Laura's home and did not mention the late Greg's name once during the evening. Michelle cried from time to time, but it didn't seem sincere, her sister Laura Cusick said when questioned by police. The morning after the tragedy, Michelle woke up in a great mood. She was beautifully dressed, with her hair styled and makeup on. In high spirits, the recent widow went for breakfast at a famous restaurant that served the best pancakes with syrup. While the police were looking into the theory that Greg had taken his own life, struggling to find a motive and obtain credible evidence of it, Michelle herself presented the investigation with first a motive and then evidence of her guilt. Going through the documents from the first interrogation, the investigators were attracted by Michelle's words that she didn't care about a single penny. But her actions proved otherwise. After Greg's death, Michelle quickly begins liquidating assets from family companies and spending large sums of money. She cashes checks through Greg's IT company. The amount of checks cashed is not disclosed anywhere. In all likelihood, we are talking about a lot of money. After receiving cash from the sale of the Blueberries frozen yogurt store in Keller, Michelle made one of her biggest blunders. She went to the insurance company, hoping to get a payout on Greg's life insurance policy. Michelle was the sole beneficiary on Greg's life insurance policy, which was taken out on August 12, 2011, almost exactly 2 months before he was killed. But one important fact the woman missed. According to the terms of the insurance policy, Greg's death was not an insured event because he left his life voluntarily, and at the last moment, she was denied the money. The desire to get the insured sum of $600,000 was the main motive for the crime. Later, another important fact of financial fraud comes to light that casts suspicion on the widow. Fictitious financial documents for a mortgage loan were used to purchase the house that Greg and Michelle had been preparing for on the eve of his death. The account numbers were intentionally changed, and the lender did not immediately notice the elaborate fraud. When Greg died, Michelle canceled a meeting with the mortgage company, and the fake account was not discussed until it caught the attention of the police. Michelle, confident of her impunity, writes a check for $18,000 to attorney Kenneth Wincorn and takes a week-long vacation to Grapevine with her children. During the 3-month investigation into Greg Williams' death, police were able to unravel his wife's web of deceit. An autopsy was performed on Greg, which proves that the man was shot from a range of 12 to 18 inches. Moreover, the toxicology examination conducted provided a report proving that Greg had a large dose of sleeping pills in his system at the time of his death. Also, the police determined that there was no assault on the house. Mrs. Williams sedated her husband and shot him from a foot away after turning up the volume on the television. Daughter Michelle, who was asleep in her room, did not hear anything. On November 3, 2011, based on the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's report, Greg Williams' death was officially ruled a homicide. Michelle Williams was arrested on January 9th as she was on her way to a fitness center. She was charged with murder, tampering with evidence, and making a false statement to police. Michelle was both the only witness to the crime and the only suspect. Bail was set at $522,000 to be released from custody pending a court hearing. But Michelle spent a week in custody and was released on $85,000. Dressed in gym clothes, Michelle walked out of jail with a GPS monitor and under the arm of attorney Kenneth Wincorn, who was now officially representing her. Greg's first wife, Kathy, was furious when she found out that attorney Wincorn was defending Michelle. That money she paid him was part of Greg's estate, and it should never have gone to pay the legal bills of the woman who was accused of killing him. Online court records list Kenneth Wincorn as the attorney for Katie and Greg's divorce in 2003, and Wincorn's name and signature appear on legal documents regarding the custody agreement for their shared daughter Taylor in 2008. However, Kenneth Wincorn's defense of collusion with Michelle Williams will be exonerated by providing evidence. The divorce was handled by his company, and he personally never represented Greg. Kenneth Wincorn said he first learned of Greg's murder from an IT company employee. It was very shocking, Wincorn says, adding that Michelle later sought his help. After her plot to cash in on Greg's death is foiled, Michelle Williams changes her name to Shelley and appears as a fitness guru hoping to start a new life. On Facebook, Shelley publicly announced her relationship with Gene Wallace, a friend of her oldest son, a man nearly 15 years younger than her. Shelley and Gene opened a fitness club in Bedford and heavily promoted it online. Armed with an ankle bracelet with a GPS tracker, Michelle spent the next few months enjoying her new boyfriend, fitness classes, and court hearings. She often appeared in court dressed for a night out on the town, wearing miniskirts, knee-length boots, and deep-cut blouses. She never mourned Greg's death for a second, says Greg's ex-wife, Kathy. Rob Conover was friends with Greg Williams for more than 20 years and attended many of Michelle's hearings. He recalls how she deftly manipulated police officers at the courthouse, making them see her as an innocent woman in need of protection. On October 9, 2013, 45-year-old Michelle Williams took a plea deal with the county and pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence and deadly conduct. She will receive 18 years in prison for tampering with evidence and for deadly dangerous conduct, a third-degree felony that only exists in a few states. Although Michelle admitted that she cleaned the gun and Greg's body, the absence of her DNA at the scene raised doubts about whether the first-degree murder charge would stick. Things can go differently. Play big. Win big or lose big, Michelle said in an interview. With the plea bargain, I expect to do a couple years, and after that, I'll be out on parole. But in February 2014, Michelle Williams, in an interview, suddenly changes her testimony and says she is not guilty of the crime. The judge immediately rescinds the plea bargain and sets a date for the first trial. Opening arguments have begun in the trial of a Texas woman, dubbed by the media as Keller's Black Widow, who was accused of intentionally targeting her husband in 2011 for an insurance payoff. Michelle Williams, 45, was charged with the crime. In court, prosecutors described the crime as a clearly planned scheme of acts to profit from Greg's substantial life insurance policy. In their opening statement, prosecutors told jurors that Mrs. Williams shot her husband in the head after drugging him with sleeping pills beforehand in order to collect on his life insurance policy. The motive was money. Time-tested money. Greed. Assistant District Attorney Jack Strickland said in court. Although Michelle admitted that she cleaned the gun and Greg's body, the absence of her DNA at the scene raised doubts about whether the first-degree murder charge would stick. In response to an interview request, Michelle's attorney released a statement on her behalf. Attorney Kenneth Wincorn described the difficulties in the case caused by the spotlessly clean crime scene. The prosecution struggled to prove a premeditated crime, disregarding the fact that there was no DNA from the suspect. In repeated searches, cleaning products were found, but it stands to reason that Michelle's fingerprints were on them, since the products were in the house where she lived and did the cleaning. If the jury concludes that Michelle tampered with evidence of Greg's death, making it look like the man had spontaneously passed away, and then cleaned up the crime scene by hiding evidence and then lying about it, she will get a life sentence. But if Michelle is sentenced as scheduled on April 21st, no jury will ever get a chance to hear the whole story and decide on the appropriate punishment. Through careful questioning of the Williams couple's friends and acquaintances, information regularly emerged about the unfavorable environment that had prevailed in their family for a long period of time. According to the studied correspondence in social networks and messengers, it was found that the couple quarreled very often, and the reason was finances. At the trial, prosecutors said that in the hours leading up to the violent death, Greg Williams argued with his wife over their finances and even slapped her for spending a large amount of money that had been set aside as a down payment on a house. But Michelle Williams' defense argued that Greg Williams had taken his own life and that the successful business owner needed his wife alive, not dead. According to defense attorney Clay Graham, Greg Williams often suffered from depression and regularly used sedatives and steroids. On the eve of the crime, he was allegedly severely depressed due to the loss of his grandmother and best friend, who ironically had taken his own life. Defense counsel told the court that when Michelle Williams found her husband dead with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, she panicked and in a fit of fear began to cover up the tragedy without realizing it. She had one goal: to protect her 4-year-old daughter from psychological trauma by hiding the truth from her. Michelle Williams never once changed herself, presenting at court hearings in different images, with styled hair and manicure. At one hearing, the defendant, dressed in an off-white blouse and black vest, showed little emotion throughout most of the trial, but did not forget to wipe away tears during a presentation of photographs showing images of the body of murdered Greg Williams. The court also heard testimony from Michelle Williams' adult son, Andrew O'Brien, who said his mother, Michelle Williams, asked him to help frame Greg Williams' ex-wife, Kathy. She planned to blame her for Greg's death using the motive of unreconciled differences over the custody of their daughter, Taylor. But that plan was a failure from the get-go. After all, there was never any disagreement between the former spouses about the custody of their daughter, and it would have been very difficult to prove otherwise. Asked about his reaction to his mother's unusual request, 26-year-old Andrew O'Brien said he was very shocked by such a proposal and thought she was having a mental breakdown. Michelle confronted her sons at the trial when they testified against her. The jury later found Michelle guilty of felony tampering with physical evidence. According to the show, she provided false information that she was pregnant with twins, hoping to delay her sentencing. But this version was not confirmed and the verdict was announced. Michelle's acting abilities and her natural charm, which she tried her best to demonstrate during each hearing, did not spare her from a harsh sentence. Sandwiched between a scenario in which she was a cold-blooded criminal and one in which she was portrayed as a deranged wife and mother acting on impulse, Michelle chose the latter. "He did it," she said, wrapping her arms around her head. Michelle even congratulated the detective on solving the case. "I wouldn't have gotten through the day," she said. "You've won." Even before the police admitted to doubting Michelle's story, few believed Greg had lost his life. He had too much to live for, and he knew all too well how much pain an untimely death causes. Kathy Williams believes that Michelle's relationship with Gene Wallace began when Greg was still alive and may be the elusive motive for this crime. If Greg had found out she was sleeping with her little boyfriend, he would have dumped her, and she would have gotten nothing, Katie says. Greg was willing to put up with a lot, but he wasn't willing to put up with cheating. "She's ruined so many lives you can't even imagine," Brandon says. "She's a professional manipulator. If the courts had gone further and interviewed all of us, things could have gone in a different direction." Michelle was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The judge also ruled that she would have to serve a minimum of 30 years before being eligible for parole. Michelle currently remains incarcerated at Mountain View Prison in Gatesville, Texas. Michelle Williams is a felon and fraudster who is currently serving time in prison for all of her willful acts. She has never shown remorse for her actions and still refuses to take full responsibility for her crime. Have you heard the story about the nuclear power plant employee from Springfield who is having problems with his wife? No, we're not talking about Homer Simpson. We're talking about this guy. Sounds legit, right? Wrong. What you heard just now was the voice of an extremely talented liar. In 1995, Mark Winger, a nuclear power plant technician in Springfield, Illinois, murdered his wife by beating her to death with a hammer. In an even darker twist to the story, he framed someone else for the murder, married their child's nanny shortly afterwards, and got away with murder for nearly 4 years. So how did he do it? Hi, and welcome to Mysterious 7. I'm Michael, and today I'm going to take you guys through another case with the most insane twists you've ever heard. In June of 1995, it seemed like life couldn't possibly get any better for Mark and Donna Winger. The nuclear technician and his wife had been happily married for several years, and they had just adopted a newborn baby girl named Bailey. Donna was the oldest of 3 sisters in what they described as an incredibly close-knit family. The Dreschers grew to love Mark too. He was smart, Jewish. He was attractive and he was fun, Donna's sister Jenny Levin told the media. Donna just felt like she had found her person. After Mark and Donna Winger were married in 1989, he was offered a job and the newlyweds settled in Springfield, Illinois. We always joked about the fact when one sister marries, That husband Mary's 3 sisters, Levin said. We shared our lives with Mark. Donna was working as an operating room technician and Mark was a nuclear engineer. Donna couldn't have been happier. The only thing she would have liked was to have a child, her stepfather, Ira Drescher, said. Donna's mother, Sarah Jane Drescher, said her daughter was overwhelmed when she learned that she could not get pregnant. But then one day while working at the hospital, a doctor told Donna that a teenager was looking to put her baby up for adoption. Adopting the child was an easy decision for her. She looked at me with tears when she said, "Michelle, I knew it the minute they put the baby into my arms. She has always been mine," Donna's sister Michelle Hansen said. The Wingers welcomed baby Bailey into their home on June 1st, 1995. Donna's family said the couple loved their new roles as parents. They seemed to have all the makings of a long and happy life together. Mark was just as excited to become a dad as Donna was to become a mom, Hansen said. Donna had met the woman who would eventually become her best friend, Deanne Schultz, at the hospital. And with the arrival of Bailey, the two bonded over motherhood. But then everything turned dark. In August 1995, Donna took baby Bailey on a trip to Hollywood, Florida, to visit Donna's family. Her mother had just dropped the two of them off at the airport and hired a driver to pick them up in St. Louis, Missouri, and drive them back to Springfield. So after the visit, the two flew into St. Louis Airport and hopped in a cab driven by Roger Harrington with a 2-hour ride back to Springfield. During the course of the drive, Harrington reportedly began flirting with Donna and talking about drugs and orgies. Detective Charlie Cox, a police officer who investigated Donna's death, later said, "This gentleman started opening up to Donna about issues he was having. He had a voice in his head named Dom. Dom would tell him to do bad things. Recently, Dom was telling him to hurt people." After Donna safely arrived home with Bailey, she called the transit company to make a formal complaint about Harrington's behavior, and the driver was suspended. Cox later said that the driver started flirting with Donna, telling her he liked older women and even invited her to attend what he described as one of his sex parties. Donna had told her family that the ride was terrifying because he was driving erratically at 75 miles per hour. After the harrowing ride, Donna had been the victim of some strange phone calls, Weinhoft said. The family had believed that the driver had been stalking her and was a danger. Donna called the limousine company to file a complaint and Harrington was suspended. Mark argued his wife to write down the story in case they might need it. Police later found the note describing Donna's harrowing ride in her handwriting at the crime scene. Donna also told Mark about the experience, and though he played a part of the supportive husband and helped her file the complaint, it turned out that he had ulterior motives for doing so. Just days later, Mark invited Harrington to their home, perhaps under the pretense of helping him get his job back. On the 29th of August 1995, the cab driver wrote Mark's name, address, and the time on a scrap of paper in his car, drove to the Wingers' home, walked inside with a coffee cup and a pack of cigarettes, and was shot twice in the head. Mark Winger then called 911 and told the dispatcher he'd just shot a man who was killing his wife. He informed police that he'd been walking on the treadmill in the basement when he heard a commotion upstairs. He grabbed his gun, went to investigate, and found Harrington swinging a hammer at Donna. In an effort to defend his wife, he'd shot the man twice. Police arrived on the scene to find that both Donna and Harrington still had a weak pulse. Mark was in a back bedroom rolling back and forth in total shock. When former Springfield Police Detective Charlie Cox arrived at the Wingers' home, he remembered they could see the victims from the front door. Donna was clinging to life, said Sangamon County Assistant State Attorney Steve Weinholt. She had been hit no less than 7 times in the head with a hammer. The second victim, a white man, had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head, but still had a pulse when police arrived, said Weinholt. It was quite chaotic, Cox said. I knew that they were probably going to be transporting the victim soon, so I wanted to try and get identification on the male suspect. Cox found the man's wallet and was able to identify him as Roger Harrington. Police recovered a bloody hammer near the 2 bodies and found Mark's .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun, a yellow mug, and a pack of cigarettes on the same dining table. They also noticed that Harrington's car had been parked against traffic, facing the wrong direction. At the crime scene, Cox said Mark was very upset and very emotional, and that he repeatedly asked who the man he'd killed was. Cox avoided identifying Harrington and tried to calm Mark down. As police combed through the scene, Mark asked police if the intruder's name was Roger. Cox confirmed that it was. Mark was shocked and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's the man who's been harassing my wife this week," Cox said. Cox, who was familiar with Harrington after he'd lived in a trailer park owned by Cox, believed Harrington might have snapped. "I knew him as a very volatile type subject. He and his wife rented a trailer for me," Cox said. "Knowing what I knew about Mr. Harrington in the past, how quick he was to anger, I thought that very well he could have gone over there to try to get his job back. There's a hammer laying right there on the table. He picks it up and goes into a rage, then the husband shoots the bad guy." Tragically, both victims succumbed to their injuries. After learning about Donna's previous run-in with Harrington and listening to Mark's version of events, the police closed the case within days, listing Roger Harrington as the culprit. Because once police examined the scene and listened to Mark's story, detectives concluded that he had acted in self-defense. The case was closed in about 48 hours, Weinholt said. But Harrington's family insisted from the beginning that their son was harmless. "He was no troublemaker. He was a good kid. He wouldn't even strike at anybody," his mother, Helen Harrington, said. "I don't think he would hurt anybody, and I don't think he was crazy." So it seemed like Mark Winger was going to get away with murder. Donna's mother spoke to the media about the evening, and the family received the news of her daughter's murder. "It was 4 a.m, and I said, 'Jenny, it's Mom. Something terrible has happened,' Sarah Jane Drescher said of her call to Levin. "We sat there in my room, just crying at this unimaginable loss," Levin said. In the following months, Donna's mother and sister took turns traveling to Illinois to help take care of Bailey. "I loved Mark because he loved Donna, and that's what was important to me," Sarah Jane Drescher said. "But I had to be very careful because I did not want to ruin my relationship with him, because I did not want to ruin my relationship with the baby. I wanted to be a grandma, and Bailey made me a grandma." Mark was now a single father raising his infant daughter on his own. Donna's family initially flew to Illinois to help out, but they couldn't stay, and they suggested Mark hire a nanny. In January 1996, he met 23-year-old Rebecca Simic, who was searching for a nanny job in the area. Rebecca told reporters, "It just felt like Bailey was the one that really needed me the most. She had been through so much already at the age of 3 months." Rebecca was wonderful with Bailey, and even Donna's family agreed that she was like an angel sent to help Mark. While she felt a little uncomfortable in the house, where 2 people had died violently, she was dedicated to giving Bailey a good childhood despite the trauma of losing her mother. "I didn't want to like Rebecca, but it was hard not to like her," Levin said. "Seeing her with Bailey, there was really nothing bad we could say about her." Meanwhile, Rebecca's role at Mark's home had begun to evolve. When you live with someone and you're taking care of a child together, it's very easy to kind of play house, Rebecca said later on. Rebecca told the media that she was blown away by what the infant had been through in such a short time. "Mark made me feel like I was like an angel sent to him from God or Donna, and it was my purpose to make this family whole again," Rebecca said. She lost 2 mothers by the time she was 3 months old, and she was so smiley, Rebecca said. "I wanted to get in there and say, I'm going to help and I'm going to make this little girl's life better." Mark helped Rebecca feel at ease in her new role. After a few months, the two found themselves sharing conversation and a glass of wine at the end of a long day. And then one thing led to another as their relationship turned intimate. Within the year, Rebecca was pregnant with Mark's child. The couple eloped in Hawaii in October 1996, just 14 months after Donna's death. "I remember asking him how he could move on so quickly," Rebecca later recalled. "And he explained to me that when you have a good marriage, it's natural for you to just want that again." Rebecca said Mark had told her he wasn't able to have children, so she said she was very surprised when she found out she was pregnant with his child only months after moving in. "Obviously, I wasn't careful. It was just kind of a shock," she said. Mark, on the other hand, was thrilled, Rebecca recalled. "It felt like it was a victory to him," she said. "Mark put pressure on me to marry him and have children with him." Rebecca said that Mark, who was Jewish when they met, even started going to church with her. She said he told her they could raise a family in a Christian home. "I would be honored to be your husband and blessed if you were my wife," Mark wrote in a letter to Rebecca. Mark's rabbi, Michael Datz, asked him about his change in faith, and he said that Mark explained, "Judaism is just too difficult and unforgiving." Rabbi Datz didn't understand, asking, "Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. What do you need forgiveness for?" He said Mark didn't respond. But then it seemed like Mark was trying almost a little too hard to leave the past behind. 16 months after his wife's death, Mark told Sarah Jane Drescher that he was going to sell the house where her daughter Donna had died and buy another one just outside of town. He and Rebecca had started a family of their own, and he started cutting ties with Donna's parents. I received a letter from Mark one day saying to me I could not be called Grandma, Sarah Jane Drescher said. I wrote him back and I begged him, please let her call me Grandma. And he said, I'm sorry, there's no way I am going to allow her to call you Grandma, and that's the way it is. Sarah said she mourned that loss for a long time. Bailey Simic, now 25, told reporters that her grandmother and grandfather, Ira Drescher, would send a birthday card to her every year. I always remember asking my mom, who's Sarah Jane and Ira, she said. My mom would always explain, like, those are Donna's parents, and they just want to let you know that, like, they love you and that they remember you. Eventually, Mark sold the house where Donna had died and moved with his new wife to the suburbs outside of Springfield. Things seemed great on the surface. They had 3 children together, and Rebecca raised Bailey as her daughter. Though chaotic, their life seemed almost perfect. Mark was a loving partner and a very involved father. That would all change quite soon. One day in early 1909, when Mark was feeling ill, Rebecca took him to the emergency room in the hospital where Donna had worked before her death. There they saw Donna's best friend and co-worker, Deanne Schultz. She seemed upset to see Mark, and Rebecca remembered that Deanne had acted strangely when she first came on Bailey's nanny, as if she were anxious to stay involved in Bailey's life. After they returned home, Mark commented that that may not be the last they heard from Deanne. He was right. In February 1999, Deanne dropped a bombshell on the police, revealing that she and Mark had been having an affair before Donna's death. She said that, at one point, he'd remarked to her that things would be easier for them if Donna was dead. She told them that after Donna's fateful ride with Roger Harrington, Mark said that he needed to get that driver to the house. All you'd need to do is find the body, he told her. Deanne never thought Mark was serious, but when Donna turned up dead soon after, she knew he had done it. Mark had threatened her not to tell anyone about the things he'd said, and she'd attempted suicide several times while struggling with her guilt. After seeing him in the hospital, she decided she couldn't keep quiet any longer. After hearing Deanne's story, police decided to take a closer look at the evidence from the day of the murders. The more they thought about what they'd once assumed was an open and shut case, the more questions they had. Why were there no signs of forced entry into the Winger home that August day? Why would Roger Harrington bring his cup of coffee and cigarettes into the house with him if he'd planned to attack Donna? And why would he use the Winger's hammer as a weapon when he had a tire iron and a knife in his car? At that point, investigators came upon 3 never-before-seen Polaroid photos taken the day of the murders. They'd been with the evidence collected in a civil suit Mark had filed against the transportation company that had employed Harrington. The position of the bodies in the photos showed that Mark's version of events were not possible. Mark Winger had stated that Roger Harrington was kneeling right next to Donna Winger's head and he was beating her with a hammer, Weinhoft explained. He stated that he shot him and that the man fell backward so that his feet remained near Donna's head. In reality, the Polaroid photographs show the exact opposite. Blood spatter experts agreed. Cox later told the media, I was ashamed of the way the investigation went. I heard Roger Harrington's family. I ran his name through hell for no reason. I mean, he was an innocent victim. It had become clear that Mark was the real murderer behind the scenes the whole time. Rebecca Simic was left to make sense of the tragedy. She had no idea what Mark was capable of, and afterward, she moved her 4 children out of Springfield to feel safer. While Mark had tried to keep Bailey away from Donna's family, Rebecca encouraged them to be reunited. We'd been hurt a lot by the same person, Rebecca said, but it didn't break us. Donna's family and Rebecca spoke to reporters about the horrific realization that Mark was a manipulative killer hiding behind the mask of a brilliant engineer and a kind, loving husband and father. In December 1999, more than 4 years after the murders, the Springfield State Journal-Register ran an article based on allegations in the civil lawsuit that Mark had arranged the murder himself and killed both his wife and Harrington. The allegations were based on a blood spatter expert hired by Bark Transportation in the case after the arrest of their employee Harrington. Everything came to a head. It changed everything, Rebecca said of the article. I mean, it went from Mark as the hero who was defending his wife, this noble stand-up guy, that every man wanted to pat on the back, to a manipulative, deviant murderer. As the detectives continued their reinvestigation, they learned that Harrington's roommate, Susan Collins, had initially told police that someone asked to meet with Harrington on the day of the murders, and that she'd seen Harrington on the phone arranging that meeting. Inside Harrington's car, they found a note written on a bank deposit slip with Mark's name, his address, and the time to be there. Roger Harrington was not an intruder, but rather he was lured into that home by Mark Winger, Weinhoft said. Deanne Schultz's cooperation with police and evidence that raised questions about Mark's story prompted the voluntary dismissal of the civil suit against Bark Transportation. "I didn't see it coming," Rebecca said. "I didn't know that this whole investigation was brewing. I never thought the whole time that they thought my husband was a diabolical murderer." A warrant was issued for Mark's arrest, and he was taken into custody while at work. "I had made plans to go to McDonald's Playland," Rebecca recalled. "We were there and I got a phone call, and it was Mark's secretary, and she told me that Mark had just been arrested. I was just sick. Like my whole body kind of went numb, and I just couldn't believe it. I was shaking so badly, and I just remembered feeling so scared. I felt that I owed it to him and to my kids to just stand by him," she said. Hanson, Donna's sister, said she didn't feel relieved following Mark's arrest. "I still wanted to believe he was innocent," she said. "Here's this person that I know in handcuffs, and what's gonna happen?" Bailey was just 6 years old at the time of Mark's arrest. She said no longer having her father home was scary. "I just remember everyone just trying to remain calm and kind of, at the time, being like, Dad's just going away for a while and that he'll be back soon," she said. But that was no longer possible. On August 23, 2001, Mark Winger was indicted for the murders of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. At the trial in May 2002, a visibly shaky Deanne testified against Mark. The court granted her immunity in exchange for her testimony, though there was no evidence linking her to anything other than keeping Mark's terrible secret. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. One of the key points the prosecution had to prove was that Harrington had gone to the house to meet with the Wingers, not to commit a murder. They presented the cigarettes and coffee mug that he'd brought inside, as well as the weapons he'd left in his car and the note with Mark's name and address. Mark's attorney argued that Harrington was mentally ill, that he behaved erratically, and that these traits indicated he was capable of murder. When prosecutors presented the Polaroids showing the position of the bodies before they were removed from the scene, Mark's attorney argued throughout the trial that first responders could have moved the bodies. "It's our belief that Roger comes to the house, he's allowed into the home," now retired Detective Jim Graham said. "There were no signs of forced entry, and he was executed at that time." Hearing the gunshot, Donna Winger then comes from the bathroom to investigate. He then beats his wife to death with a hammer. Mark then calls 911. In the 911 call, someone can be heard moaning in the background. When Mark tells the operator he can hear his baby crying and hangs up. He had told the operator there was a bullet in Harrington's head, but when police arrived, Harrington had been shot twice. Deanne also gave damning testimony at the trial, saying that Mark told her it would be easier if Donna just died. "I thought it was crazy talk," she said during her cross-examination. After a chance meeting years later, Deanne testified that she confronted Mark in the hopes of gathering information and asked him how he lived with himself, and that he'd replied that he had found Jesus Christ and was forgiven. She said he warned her that if she ever said anything, they would both be in trouble. "I didn't think that anybody would believe her," Rebecca said. "I just thought if Mark truly did that, she would have come forward right away." Mark's defense argued that Deanne was emotionally unstable and just a woman who had been scorned. Deanne Schultz's testimony was able to demonstrate that, in reality, Mark was obviously unhappy, unfaithful, and had specifically talked about wanting to kill his wife, Weinhoft said. Schultz was granted immunity for her testimony, he added. There was no direct evidence that directly linked Deanne to actively participating in this crime. In the end, she was such a valuable witness as it relates to presenting the motive. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks, the jury found Mark Winger guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Rebecca said she believed he would be going home with them. After the verdict, she said the words guilty rang through her head and that she wanted the earth to open up and swallow me. Sarah Jane Drescher and her daughters, Donna's sisters, were with her when they heard the verdict. The three of us just embraced and cried, she said. And the story gets even more twisted, because 4 years later, Mark was also sentenced to an additional 35 years in prison when he tried to hire a hitman to kill Deanne or testifying against him. He even attempted to put out a hit against a childhood friend who had refused to pay his bail. Helen Harrington was relieved and grateful that her son had been vindicated of Donna's murder. We knew that Roger was innocent, and it finally got proven, she said. He was branded a murderer at the time, but then all this came to an end. The police also had to come to terms with the faulty initial investigation. I was ashamed of the way the investigation went, Cox said. I heard Roger Harrington's family. I ran his name through hell for no reason. I mean, he was an innocent victim. The police department had too hastily closed the case and turned a blind eye to some red flags, and to right such a wrong, it felt great, Bram added. But Rebecca said there wasn't any closure for her or her family. When we lose someone, we gather. We have a funeral, Rebecca shared. But when someone goes to prison, well, what do? You're just kind of left with this emptiness and this hole that you can't really have closure with that. It wasn't just him being sentenced to life, she said. We were sentenced to a life of a father in prison. Bailey Simic says she missed having her father around while growing up. It was really hard being in school, seeing all the other kids had their dads and that relationship, she said. And now suddenly, I couldn't just go to my dad's room or have him pick us up from school or anything like that. Ben Simic was only a year old when his dad went to prison. I can look at the pictures and look at myself and say, that kid has no idea. He was way too young to know anything that was going on, he said. Rebecca had to move out of Springfield with her kids, and the home that she'd bought with Mark was foreclosed. She had been a stay-at-home mom for 7 years, so she had no option but to file for bankruptcy. I didn't have anything to give my kids. Everything had been taken away. All I had was love, she said. Rebecca never remarried as far as we know. She raised all 4 of the children on her own. And Bailey has since reunited with Donna's family. It was so incredible to see that there's this whole big family that loves me, and Sarah Jane still has my baby picture on her kitchen counter with all of her other grandkids, even though we've been gone for so long, she said. We've been hurt a lot by the same person, but it didn't break us, Rebecca said. Although Sarah Jane Drescher says there will never be closure for the murder of her daughter, the family has worked together to set up Donna's Fund, which is a part of Women in Distress, an organization that works to provide shelter for women trying to escape abuse. I think her legacy will live on through people that we help, Levin said, and through the beautiful memories that we have of her. So what do you think of this crazy, twisted case of murder uncovered? Would Mark Winger still be walking scot-free today if his former lover, Deanne Schultz, hadn't developed a guilty conscience? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe for more in-depth coverage of some of the most manipulative murders of all time. Stay safe, friends. Until next time.